So now we're going to shift our gaze from the South after the Civil War towards the West. And let me say that westward movement, which is the topic of this study, really happens even during the Civil War, but certainly it picks up in earnest with the war's conclusion in 1865. And it will continue through the rest of the century. And much of you are aware of westward movement. Certainly it's embedded in our culture, U.S. culture. That is to say, the Wild West cowboy movies, cowboys versus Indians, and so forth. Now, before we discuss this in detail, let's consider this fact that during the late 19th century and certainly into the early 20th century, what you have happening here, and this is especially true because this is the era of our Industrial Revolution. And this is a topic we'll discuss very soon. But during this era of mass industrialization, obviously with, business exploding and commerce and so forth, you need labor. You need labor to man the factories, for example, factory workers. You need labor to construct the railroads. You need labor to mine the gold after the gold rush. So the topic of labor really looms large, certainly in this topic, westward expansion, as well as other topics that we'll discuss very soon. Now, one thing that's connected to labor is migration. Basically, what you have happening is labor migration. Okay, this occurs during the 19th century as we move west. It certainly occurs today, if you think about it. Much of our labor, whether it's people working in the fields, picking our crops and fruits and vegetables, even when we discuss, let's say, nurses in hospitals, or even engineers, right, in Silicon Valley, many of them are from abroad, foreign labor. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is a perennial theme when we talk about modern commerce or capitalism in general. So what we have happening during this period, going back to the 19th century again, is migration. Okay, and there's really simultaneous migrations that are happening during the 19th century, not just westward migration. Okay, so certainly you have westward migration. That's one form. And we'll discuss the homesteaders, so to speak, and commercial business going west. And that will be counterbalanced by another migration, and that's the pool of farmers that used to work on their small family farms, but those small family farms would collapse. Why? Because of the commercial takeover of agribusiness, of agriculture. And this will lead to those dislocated farmers moving to the great cities where you see industry happening because of the Industrial Revolution I just mentioned. Okay, and they will serve as a labor source for our commercial needs. And another stream of migration that'll be happening during this period is your immigration from abroad, namely European immigrants that would come across the Atlantic to work as industrial laborers, and not to mention Asian workers, okay, namely Chinese and later Japanese that would work in the West. And certainly that will preoccupy us with this topic of westward expansion. Now, before we have an in-depth discussion about these labor migrations, what we need to do first is think about some general ideas that many of us may have still today when we think about the West during the 1800s, the 19th century. And as we'll discuss, many of them are overblown. They're exaggerations, if not mythic renditions altogether about the West. So this is what we'll discuss first. And as you could well imagine, much of this mythic versions or just exaggerations is a result of much of American culture about the West. Think about those movies, right, or even novels that were written about the West. And therefore it entered our consciousness, the American consciousness, about what the West was about. So the first myth, as indicated in the slide, is this conception of the Wild West, so to speak, being completely separate from the so-called civilized East, right? In the east part of the United States, eastern part of the United States back then, you had, the big cities, and you had, quote, civilization. Now to the west, supposedly, there's the Wild West. That is to say, untamed, unsettled, and it's wild, right? And it's populated by Native Americans who were considered savages by most people back then. So a common notion held by many, certainly back then, and even by some today, is that there's this actual line of demarcation, if you will, between the civilized East and the Wild West. Okay? Another way to discuss this is a line between civilization and savagery. And that's really a racial way to think about it, if you ponder that, right? This is the actual idea of the frontier, okay? And a good way to think about the frontier, which we'll discuss with Turner's thesis indicated in the slide here, is that it's a line of separation. The frontier is a line of separation between civilization and savagery. Now, another, I have to say here, it's more of an exaggeration, is letter B here. And that's the idea that settlement of the West was driven primarily by, pioneers who courageously, moved west, right? They migrated west, despite the fact that, it was, quote, untamed again. Well, these were courageous pioneers that ventured to do so, and what you see is, movement after movement of brave settlers moving west until the West was settled. Well, certainly there's an element of truth to this. Of course there is, and certainly it's true that these pioneers were certainly courageous. However, we'll discuss the fact that this is overblown very soon, okay? So it leaves open the question, what was the main driver of westward movement, right? If it wasn't the brave pioneers. Well, we'll address that question very soon. Now, a third idea, which is completely mythic, is this idea that the West was vacant of settlement. Okay, there's this imagined vacancy that describes the West during the 19th century, and therefore it's open land to be taken, to be claimed by American settlers moving west. All right, so these three are a sort of a cluster of myths, if not exaggerations, that inform our idea, our notion, our conception of the West. And as I mentioned, some may still believe this today, if you never thought about it deeply, right? Now, another reason, or certainly a main reason, why this notion crystallized as a way to think about the West, is due to an actual historian. Okay, his name was Frederick Jackson Turner, and he was writing American history towards the end of the 19th century. And I have to say this, the year 1890 is very important in this topic, because 1890 was a year that the U.S. government, the U.S. Census, declared that the frontier is no longer existing, okay, that we see the close of the frontier. Why? Because pretty much U.S. civilization has moved from East Coast to West Coast, okay? Civilization has moved inexorably from sea to shining sea, so to speak, to the point where we have even the shape, the geographic shape of the continental U.S. by 1890. So this momentous event in U.S. history inspired Frederick Jackson Turner to write the so-called frontier thesis. And here's some main points that are associated with Turner's thesis, otherwise known as the Turnerian thesis. As indicated in the slide, well, Turner explains westward movement from the colonial period through 1890, when they declared the frontiers closed, as this movement of civilization overcoming savagery. And this is what I just explained, right? And that idea largely comes from Turner. And he connects this with U.S. history in general, okay? U.S. history from the colonial period, from, say, Jamestown in 1807 through the ensuing centuries. Well, what happens here is civilization overcoming savagery, right? And therefore you see this idea of race, that is to say, European settlers that are leading to the vanquishing of Native Americans. You see that tied with geographic expansion, moving from east to west. Okay, so imagine this, for example. Let's say I just mentioned Jamestown in 1607. Well, you can imagine the settlement of Jamestown, a little tiny dot on the map on Virginia in 1607. And surrounding that tiny dot, right, is savagery. Now, as the decades and even centuries pass, you have more and more and more of English settlers, other European settlers. So you see the expansion of, quote, civilization, right? The expansion of those dots that were originally there, expanding westward, to the point where we reached the year 1890. Well, the whole continent is now described as civilization, right? So that is Turner's thesis, one part of it. And he claims, therefore, that westward movement is exactly the enabling condition giving rise to unique American values, such as what? Ingenuity, right? If you're a pioneer, you have to think about ways to survive, right? And deal with the unknown. Certainly it gives rise to what we call rugged individualism, according to Turner, right? Turner further claims it gives rise to democracy and equality. That's to say, in the absence of authority in the West, it leads to more equality and an outlook of democracy. Certainly optimism, this idea that you could start or even restart your life as you move west. Okay, and much of that is still with us today. All right, so this is Turner's thesis. It's, again, this constellation of ideas that Turner argued, actually, explains U.S. history and the significance of the close of the frontier. Now, how true is the Turnerian thesis? Now, modern historians do not claim that it is completely false, okay, but it does omit some stuff. Okay, certainly there's validity to this idea of, for example, that westward movement gave rise to unique American values. Certainly you could talk about, westward movement as explaining large part of U.S. history. But what it leaves out is this, that westward movement, as indicated on this new slide, was primarily driven by capitalist expansion. Okay, that's to say, as capitalism grows, it expands geographically, right? And there is this necessary link between the pursuit of profit that is part and parcel of capitalism as an economic enterprise. The pursuit of profit leads to geographic expansion. For example, think about this. At one point,